Light from the panoramic windows flooded the living room with a cold, almost sterile glow. Everything here screamed of success: designer furniture that cost as much as a small car, abstract art on the walls, perfect order. Mark, the master of this house and this success, sat in an armchair with a laptop on his knees, his face illuminated only by the screen. The clicking of keys was the only sound disturbing the silence of this vast space, save for Sarah's barely audible sigh. She stood by the window, looking at the impeccably manicured lawn that smoothly transitioned into the darkening trees at the edge of their property somewhere in a prestigious Connecticut suburb. Mark was 48, and he was at the top. Owner of a thriving architectural firm, a respected man. He sincerely believed he gave his wife, Sarah, everything one could dream of. A house, full to the brim. Money, sure. Freedom: do whatever you want, dear, just don't distract me from important matters. And Mark always had important matters. Sarah was 42. Once, her laughter rang like crystal, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity for life. Now, laughter was a rarity, and a shadow of fatigue in something Mark, if he even noticed, would call women's nonsense, had settled in her eyes. She ran her hand over the cold glass. Beyond it, the evening was beginning, the same as yesterday, as a week ago. Silent. Empty. Honey, do you remember we were supposed to go to the Hendersons tomorrow? Her voice sounded too loud in the silence. Mark, without looking up from the screen, waved his hand. Ah, yeah, something like that. Postpone it, will you? I've got a deadline burning, you know, this Japanese project. Sarah didn't answer. She knew. She always knew everything. About the deadlines, about the Hendersons being offended for the third time, and about the dinner she had spent almost 2 hours preparing, which would again grow cold while he finished one little thing. She silently moved away from the window and sat on the sofa, as far away from Mark as possible. She picked up a glossy magazine, but her gaze slid over the bright pictures, not lingering. Her thoughts were far away. She remembered how once, long ago, at the beginning of their relationship, they could talk for hours about everything under the sun, how he looked at her, really looked, saw her. When did it end? When did she turn into just another element of his flawless interior? By the way, Mark suddenly looked up from his laptop, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Leo called. He's coming for a few weeks. Got kicked out of college, or maybe he left himself, I didn't quite get it. We'll have to figure something out for him. Leo. Mark's son from his first marriage. Sarah had always found him more likable than irritating, unlike his mother, Mark's ex-wife. The boy was 22, and he was different. Not like his father. Sarah had only seen him a few times at family gatherings but remembered his thoughtful gaze and quiet smile. When is he coming? She asked, feeling a strange, barely perceptible stirring. Day after tomorrow, I think. You figure out where to put him. The guest bedroom is free, right? Mark put his glasses back on and dove back into work. Yes, it's free, Sarah replied quietly. And silence fell again. But this time, there was a faint hint of anticipation in it. Maybe Leo's arrival would at least slightly dispel this oppressive atmosphere of the gilded cage in which she was suffocating. Maybe. Or maybe it was just another illusion she had been desperately clinging to lately. She looked at her husband, who had once again turned into a silhouette behind the screen's light. Don't do this, she wanted to scream. Don't make me invisible. Don't forget I'm alive. But the words stuck in her throat. As always. Leo arrived 2 days later, in the afternoon. He stood on the threshold, a little awkward, with a large backpack slung over his shoulder and a guitar in a battered case. Tall, lean, with a shock of dark hair that perpetually fell over his eyes, and those same thoughtful gray eyes Sarah remembered. He was dressed simply: jeans, a t-shirt with the name of some obscure band, sneakers. The complete opposite of his father with his immaculate suits and expensive watches. Mark greeted his son reservedly, though seemingly cordially. A few perfunctory phrases about the journey, about how he'd grown. He clapped him on the shoulder and immediately switched to a phone call, discussing something businesslike and gesturing to Sarah, as if to say, "You handle this." Classic. Sarah, however, felt a genuine liking for Leo. "Hi, Leo. Good to see you. Come on in, make yourself at home." Her voice sounded warmer than she herself expected. "Thanks, Sarah. I won't stay long, don't want to be in the way." He smiled slightly, and for a moment, his face became boyishly open. "Nonsense, what kind of guest are you?" "Your family," she replied, leading him to the guest room. "If you need anything, just ask, don't be shy." The room was spacious, bright, with a large bed and access to a terrace. Leo looked around. "It's very nice here. Almost too nice for me." He placed his guitar by the wall. Sarah noticed how carefully he did it, as if it weren't just an object, but a living creature. "You play?" "I try," he smiled again. "Mostly for myself. It helps to sort out my thoughts." "I understand," Sarah nodded. "I used to have a piano. I loved playing Chopin." She was surprised she said it. She hadn't shared such trifles with anyone for a long time. The piano had been sold when they moved into this house. Mark said it didn't fit the new interior, and besides, she didn't have time for tinkling anyway. "Chopin is cool," Leo's eyes sparkled with interest. "He has such melancholic beauty." They talked about music for a few more minutes. It turned out that Leo not only liked modern indie rock but also classics, especially guitar arrangements of Bach. Sarah was surprised to find it easy and pleasant to talk to him. He didn't interrupt, listened attentively, asked questions that showed he was genuinely interested. Like a breath of fresh air. Later, when Leo was unpacking, Sarah returned to the living room. Mark had finished his call and was already back at his computer. "So, how's Leo?" "Not too disappointed to be back under his father's wing?" he asked, without looking up from the monitor. "Seems okay. He's a nice kid, Mark." "Nice isn't a profession," Mark grumbled. "I'll have to have a serious talk with him about his future. Can't just fool around forever." Sarah sighed. That was Mark all over. Instead of just asking how his son was, what was on his mind, he was already planning his life. She remembered their early years together. Mark wasn't so impenetrable then. He dreamed too, laughed, they could walk for hours, holding hands, and he would tell her about his wild architectural ideas, and she would share her plans to open a small art gallery. He listened then. And heard. His eyes burned with passion not only for work but for her. Sarah went to an old chest of drawers where old photo albums were stored in one of the drawers. She rarely took them out, it was too painful to compare then and now. But today, something prompted her. She found a photo, she and Mark, young, happy, on some beach. Mark was hugging her, and they were both laughing at the sun. The ghost of that connection, that closeness they had lost, painfully pricked her heart. Deep inside, a longing stirred for the Mark who, it seemed, no longer existed. Or maybe he was just hiding behind the mask of a successful businessman, and he could still be pulled out? Hope, weak and trembling like a butterfly, fluttered for a moment in her soul. A few days passed. Leo was gradually settling in. In the mornings, he usually slept late, then wandered around the house, played his guitar in his room, quiet, melancholic melodies that strangely harmonized with Sarah's mood. Sometimes they crossed paths in the kitchen or living room, exchanging a few phrases. Sarah noticed that she involuntarily looked forward to these brief encounters. And Mark. Mark was Mark. Immersed in work, phone calls, blueprints. He seemed not to notice his son's presence at all, except for those moments when he tried to give him fatherly advice on finding a real job. "Listen, Leo, these guitar strumming of yours, it's cute, of course, but you can't earn a living with it. Maybe you could try design?" I have connections. Leo usually nodded silently, then went to his room, and soon music would come from his room, this time louder, with a raw edge. Their 15th wedding anniversary was approaching. Crystal anniversary, as Sarah had once said with hope. She had reminded Mark in advance, booked a table at their favorite restaurant, the very one where he had proposed to her. She even bought a new dress, hoping for at least one evening to bring back the magic that once existed between them. On the anniversary day, Sarah was in high spirits from the morning. She prepared Mark's favorite breakfast, put on the new dress. Waited. Mark came down for breakfast, as usual, a bit sleepy, phone in hand. "Good morning, darling. Happy anniversary to us." Sarah smiled, trying to convey her mood to him. Mark looked up from his phone, kissed her cheek perfunctorily. "Yeah, morning. What anniversary?" Everything inside Sarah went cold. "Mark, today is June 15th. Our anniversary." He froze for a moment, then slapped his forehead. "Oh, damn. Right. It totally slipped my mind, Sarah, sorry. So much stuff piled up. This Dubai contract, they're driving me nuts every day." He sat down at the table, quickly swallowed his breakfast, continuing to scroll through something on his phone. "Listen, let's celebrate this somehow over the weekend, okay? We'll go out somewhere." "I just can't today, I have meeting after meeting, then a report to finish." Sarah was silent. Words stuck in her throat like a bitter lump. 15 years. Slipped his mind. He didn't even try to come up with something more convincing. She silently cleared the table, feeling tears welling up. She went to her room, took off the new dress, which suddenly seemed ridiculous and inappropriate, and put on ordinary jeans and a sweater. It felt as if she had been hit. Not even hit, but simply pushed away, like an annoying object. Later, when Mark had left for his endless meetings, Sarah sat in the living room, mechanically flipping through the pages of a book. She heard quiet footsteps. Leo. He entered, holding a cup of tea. "Sarah, are you okay? You seem sad today." He stopped beside her, his gaze full of sincere concern. Sarah tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "Everything's fine, Leo. Just one of those days." He sat down opposite her. "Did Dad do something again?" he asked quietly, but directly. Sarah looked up at him, surprised. He understood. He saw what her own husband didn't see or didn't want to see. And suddenly she felt so sorry for herself, so lonely, that she couldn't hold back. A few tears rolled down her cheeks. "Today's our anniversary," she said. He forgot. Leo said nothing. He simply handed her his cup of warm tea. Then he went to the old record player that stood in the corner, which Mark considered junk, but Sarah couldn't bear to throw it away. Leo put on a record, some old jazz piece, melancholic and beautiful. Music filled the room, and for a moment, Sarah felt a little better. She looked at Leo. He didn't pry, didn't offer stupid advice. He was just there. And that was exactly what she had been missing so much. The tiny cracks in her marriage had long since turned into deep rifts, and the echo of every new blow of fate, every manifestation of Mark's inattention, grew louder, drowning out any hope for the better. And in this deafening silence of loneliness, Leo's voice of compassion sounded unexpectedly clear. The following weekend, Mark, as if trying to make up for the forgotten anniversary, though Sarah suspected it was more to clear his own conscience, suggested a trip out of town, for a picnic by the lake. "And we'll take Leo, let him get some air," he added magnanimously. The trip started typically. Mark spent the entire drive on the phone, resolving some work issues. Sarah silently looked out the window. Leo sat in the back seat, listening to music on his headphones, but from time to time, he cast quick glances at Sarah, as if checking if she was okay. The picnic spot was truly beautiful, a pine forest, a sandy shore, a blue lake. While Mark was lighting the grill, continuing to give instructions over the phone to his assistant, "No, Frank, the third floor needs a complete redo." "I told you, more light, to hell with those dark corridors." Sarah began to set out the food. Leo silently helped her. Their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for the fruit basket. A light, fleeting touch, but Sarah felt goosebumps run down her skin. She quickly looked away, feeling her cheeks begin to burn. When everything was ready, Mark finally put down his phone. "Well, looks like it turned out pretty well," he said, surveying the clearing. "We should do this more often." But 5 minutes later, he pulled out his phone again to quickly check his email. Sarah sighed and sat down on the blanket. Leo sat beside her. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" he said, looking at the water. "Very," Sarah agreed. "I love places like this. Quiet, nature. You can just be silent and listen to yourself. Or to someone else," Leo added, smiling faintly. They started talking. About books they had recently read, about movies that had impressed them. To her surprise, Sarah discovered that their tastes largely coincided. Leo talked about his attempts to write songs, about how hard it was to find the right words to express what was in his soul. Sarah listened, and for the first time in a long time, she was genuinely interested. She shared her thoughts, and he didn't just listen, he heard her, reacted, developed her ideas. It was that unspoken language she missed so much in her communication with Mark, the language of understanding at the level of glances, half-hints, shared emotions. At one point, Leo picked up his guitar and began to play softly. The melody was simple but very soulful. Sarah closed her eyes, surrendering to the music. It seemed to her that this melody was telling her own story, about loneliness, about unexpressed longing, about the hope that still flickered somewhere deep inside. When he finished, she opened her eyes. Leo was looking at her, and in his gaze, there was something so warm, compassionate, and at the same time a little unsettling. That was wonderful, Leo," she said quietly. Mark, who had finally detached himself from his phone, approached them. "Oh, you're having a concert here? Well, good job, Leo, you strum pretty well. Maybe you can play at our corporate party sometime? Cheer up the accountants." He tried to joke, but it came out clumsy and even a bit dismissive. Leo said nothing, just tensed slightly. Sarah felt irritation towards Mark rising inside her again. Why was he like this? Why couldn't he just be different? At least sometimes. On the way home, Mark was on the phone again. Sarah looked at the darkening trees outside the window. She remembered that fleeting touch of Leo's hand, his gaze, his music. And she felt scared. Scared that these little things evoked far more emotions in her than all of Mark's attempts to make amends. This was dangerous territory, and she knew it. But at the same time, she craved warmth, understanding, at least a drop of that genuine connection she once had and which now seemed so distant and unattainable in her marriage. And this unspoken language, which she suddenly heard in her communication with Leo, beckoned her like a light in the darkness. After that picnic, something imperceptibly changed. The tension in the house became almost physically palpable. Sarah tried to avoid Leo, afraid of her own reactions, her thoughts, which increasingly revolved around him. But their paths constantly crossed, and every accidental meeting, every short conversation only intensified her inner turmoil. Mark, as usual, noticed nothing, engrossed in his affairs. Or pretended not to notice. One evening, when Mark was once again late from work, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had to talk to him. Try to get through to him. Maybe this was the last chance. She waited for him in the living room, as if for a trial. When he finally arrived, tired and irritated, she began the conversation. "Mark, we need to talk," her voice trembled betrayingly. He glanced at her quickly, unbuttoning his tie. "Sarah, I'm dead on my feet. Let's not do this tonight, okay? What happened now?" Did the neighbor's dog ruin the lawn again? No, Mark, not the dog. She tried to speak calmly, but everything inside was boiling. It's about us. About our relationship. Don't you notice that we haven't been together for a long time? We live like neighbors, like strangers under one roof. Mark sank wearily into his chair. Oh, God, Sarah, not this song again? I work like a dog so we can have everything. This house, your whims, trips. Isn't that a sign of my attitude? I thought we'd discussed this a million times. Money isn't everything, Mark. Her voice broke. I don't need your money if I don't have you. When was the last time you asked how I was? When did we just talk, not about your work, not about bills, but about us? When did you just hug me not because you had to, but because you wanted to? He stood up, began pacing the room. Here we go. Tears, hysterics. Sarah, you know I'm not a master of all these sentiments. I'm a man of action. I provide. Isn't that enough? What more do you want? I want you, she screamed. Your attention, your warmth, your love. I feel invisible, unwanted. Do you even see me? Or am I just a function to you, a wife, the lady of the house? Mark stopped, his face hardening. You know, Sarah, you just think too much. You have too much free time, that's why all sorts of nonsense gets into your head. Get busy with something. Find a hobby. Go see a psychologist if things are really that bad. But don't bust my chops after a hard day's work. I have a right to rest too. He turned and went to his study, slamming the door. Sarah remained standing in the middle of the living room, broken and devastated. It was a conversation between the deaf and the mute. He didn't just not hear her, he didn't want to hear. He devalued her feelings, her pain, reducing everything to female hysterics and too much free time. Classic this. This was worse than just inattention. It was a conscious unwillingness to understand, to admit that a problem existed. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She felt utterly alone. At that moment, Leo quietly entered the living room. He must have heard the whole conversation. His face was serious and compassionate. He approached her, silently took her hand, and gently squeezed her fingers. Sarah, I'm so sorry, he said quietly. His touch, his simple words of support were like a lifeline to a drowning person. She looked at him through her tears, and in his eyes, she saw the understanding she had so vainly sought from her own husband. He didn't judge, didn't offer advice. He was just there. And at that moment, it seemed to her that he was the only person in the whole world who understood her. Thank you, Leo, she whispered, barely audible. And this simple gratitude, this moment of connection against the backdrop of Mark's glaring misunderstanding, became another step towards that dangerous line Sarah was inexorably approaching. She felt that a little more, and she might do something she would later regret. Or, maybe not. Mark returned from Chicago the next day, as usual, full of impressions from successful negotiations and irritated by trifles like a flight delay. He seemed not to notice any changes in Sarah, although she herself felt as if "I almost cheated on you with your son" was written on her face in capital letters. She tried to act normally, but her movements were stiff, her voice tense. Leo was also acting strangely. He avoided Sarah, tried not to meet her gaze. If they accidentally met in the hallway or kitchen, an awkward silence, filled with unsaid words and memories of that evening, would arise. However, although Mark was usually blind to emotional nuances, something in this new atmosphere did alert him. Perhaps it was the excessive silence between Sarah and Leo, which had replaced their previous light conversations. Perhaps it was Sarah's guilty look, which she tried to hide. Or maybe just his own subconscious fears and insecurities, which he so carefully masked behind the facade of a successful macho. One evening, when Leo had gone for a walk, Mark suddenly turned to Sarah with an unexpected question. Listen, Sarah, what's going on between you and Leo? His tone was surprisingly calm, but suspicion glinted in his eyes. Sarah flinched. What do you mean? She tried to make her voice sound indifferent. Well, I don't know. You two have been acting strange lately. You're too nice to him, or something. And he looks at you like. Mark trailed off, as if searching for words. Sarah's heart began to pound. Mark, don't be ridiculous. Leo is your son, he lives in our house. Of course, I try to be friendly to him. What's wrong with that? Friendly is one thing, but I think there's something more here. Mark looked her intently in the eyes. Haven't you forgotten that he's young enough to be your son? And that you're a married woman? These words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. The accusation, unfair and brutal, especially from the lips of the man who himself had driven her to this state. How can you say such a thing? Her voice trembled with indignation. You don't know me at all if you can suspect me of this. It's disgusting, Mark. Disgusting? And fooling around with a young guy when your husband is right here, isn't that disgusting? Mark was starting to get worked up. I'm not blind, Sarah. I see how you look at him, how you come alive when he's around. You haven't been like that with me for a long time. I'm not like that with you because you pushed me away yourself. Sarah exploded. For years, you haven't noticed me, ignored my feelings, my needs. And now, when someone simply showed me a drop of human attention, you suddenly woke up and accused me of all mortal sins? It's all your fault, Mark. Yours. She knew her words were a defense, an attempt to shift some of the blame, but she couldn't stop. His accusations, though partly intuitively correct, seemed to her the height of cynicism. My fault? Of course, it's always the husband's fault, Mark smiled bitterly. Well, if you're so unhappy with me, maybe you really should look for happiness elsewhere? Just not in my house and not with my son, please. He turned and left the room, leaving Sarah alone, torn by conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she felt relief at having said everything to his face. On the other, she was frightened by the ease with which he spoke of a possible breakup. And most of all, she was tormented by guilt towards Leo. She had dragged him into this dirty story, and now he too was the object of Mark's suspicions. Mark's suspicion, though expressed crudely, actually only strengthened Sarah's emotional bond with Leo. After all, Leo was the only one who didn't blame her, who understood her loneliness. And although Sarah continued to deny any improper feelings, deep down she knew that Mark, unwittingly, was pushing her even closer to that very line she feared so much. Every word he said, every suspicion was another nail in the coffin of their marriage and, perhaps, another step towards the inevitable. The next few days were sheer hell. Mark walked around gloomy and silent, casting heavy glances at Sarah and Leo. The atmosphere in the house was so tense it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Leo tried to keep his distance, spending most of his time in his room or walking alone somewhere. Sarah felt cornered. On one side, her husband's cold condemnation, on the other, her own guilt and a dangerous attraction to Leo. Sarah's birthday was approaching. 43. A date that would previously have caused her mild sadness now seemed just another reason for disappointment. She expected nothing from Mark, especially after their last fight. But somewhere deep inside, a naive hope still flickered. What if? What if he remembered, tried to somehow make amends, show that he cared about her? On her birthday, Mark dryly wished her well in the morning, handed her an envelope with money, buy yourself something nice, dear, and left for work. No flowers, no warm words. Just another duty fulfilled. Sarah felt the last drop of hope evaporate, leaving only a bitter residue. She spent the first half of the day alone, trying to distract herself by reading, but the words wouldn't sink in. Leo returned towards evening. He came into the living room where Sarah was sitting and handed her a small package tied with a simple ribbon. Sarah, this is for you. Happy birthday. His voice was quiet and a little awkward. Sarah took the gift, surprised. It was a small, neatly framed photograph. The photo showed an autumn landscape, a lake, trees in crimson. A very beautiful, professionally taken shot. Leo, did you take this? He nodded. Yes, last fall. I thought you might like it. You love nature, right? Sarah looked at the photo, and tears welled up in her eyes. It was such a simple, yet such a sincere gift. He remembered what she loved. He had thought about her. Unlike her own husband. Thank you, Leo. This is the best gift, her voice trembled betrayingly. At that moment, Mark walked in. He saw the gift in Sarah's hands, her tear-filled eyes, Leo standing beside her. His face contorted with rage. What's going on here? Cooing again? I asked you, Sarah, to stay away from him, he shouted. Mark, stop it. Sarah jumped to her feet. Leo just wished me a happy birthday. Is that a crime? A crime is what you're doing to our marriage. The way you humiliate me, flirting with my son right under my nose. Mark advanced on her. I'm not humiliating anyone. You're the one humiliating me with your indifference, your callousness. You haven't noticed me for years, and now suddenly you're jealous? Of whom? Of someone who simply showed me a drop of warmth? Sarah no longer held back her tears and anger. The argument escalated like a wildfire. They shouted at each other, accusing each other of all mortal sins. Leo stood aside, pale and bewildered, trying to say something, but no one heard him. And suddenly, Mark said something that was the last straw. Something incredibly offensive, cruel, concerning her femininity, her age, her uselessness. Words that were impossible to forgive. Sarah fell silent, as if struck. She looked at Mark with empty eyes, then slowly turned to Leo. There was such despair in her gaze, such pain, that Leo's heart clenched. She walked right up to him, took his face in her hands, and looking him straight in the eyes, said, "Take me away from here, Leo. Please. Just take me away from here." And before he could answer, she pulled him to her and kissed him. It was a kiss of despair, a kiss of protest, a kiss of revenge. A kiss that burned all bridges. Mark froze on the spot, his face first expressing shock, then fury, and then, a strange, devastated bewilderment. He watched his wife kissing his son and couldn't utter a word. The point of no return had been crossed. The air in the room crackled with tension, with the unsaid, with the inevitable. And each of the three understood that after this, nothing would ever be the same. Absolutely nothing. The kiss lasted only a moment, but that moment stretched into an eternity. When Sarah pulled away from Leo, her face was pale but resolute. She didn't look at Mark. She looked at Leo, as if searching for an answer, support, salvation in him. Leo stood stunned, his cheeks burning, a mixture of embarrassment, compassion, and something else he himself perhaps couldn't fully comprehend in his eyes. Mark finally snapped out of it. His face was contorted by a grimace of pain and disbelief. "Sarah. What are you doing?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. It was no longer the shout of an enraged man, but rather the whisper of a wounded animal. Sarah slowly turned her head towards him. There were no more tears in her eyes, only cold, desolate resolve. "I'm doing what you yourself have been pushing me towards for years, Mark. I'm just existing. I'm trying to feel alive." "With my son?" Bitterness crept into his voice. "You decided to feel alive with my own son? And with whom was I supposed to feel alive, Mark? With you? With a man for whom I long ago turned into a piece of furniture? With a man who forgets our anniversary, my birthday, my very existence? With a man who accuses me of all mortal sins without noticing his own guilt?" Each of her words was like the lash of a whip. Mark was silent. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time in many years, something like realization appeared in his gaze. Perhaps it was the shock of what he had seen. Perhaps her words had finally pierced the thick armor of his self-confidence and emotional deafness. He suddenly saw not just a hysterical wife, but a woman on the brink of despair, a woman whom he himself, step by step, day by day, had pushed towards this abyss. He remembered all those moments that now, like in a kaleidoscope, flashed before his eyes. Forgotten dates. Unheard complaints. Dismissive jokes. Constant excuses about work. His unwillingness to talk, unwillingness to listen, unwillingness to simply be there. Everything he had considered trifles, women's whims, suddenly formed one solid, horrifying picture. A picture of his own emotional neglect, his blindness, his criminal indifference. There it was, this, which the title of this story screamed about, which all the signs he had ignored warned about. This was his life, his attitude. He shifted his gaze to Leo. The boy stood with his head bowed, as if the weight of the entire world had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. There was no triumphant victor in him, only deep sadness and confusion. And Mark suddenly realized that Leo was not a seducer here, not a villain. He had simply found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming an unwitting catalyst for a drama that had been brewing for years. He became the mirror in which Sarah saw the possibility of warmth, and Mark himself, the horrifying reflection of his own emptiness. I didn't know," Mark whispered. And it was true. He really didn't know. Or didn't want to know. He lived in his own world, a world of success, contracts, deadlines, and it seemed to him that this was enough. That everyone around should be happy simply because he, Mark, had achieved success. Now, this world was crumbling before his eyes. And he didn't know what to do. How to fix it. Whether it was even possible to fix it. He looked at Sarah, at her tormented but resolute face. And for the first time in many years, he felt not irritation, not anger, but a sharp, piercing pain. The pain of a loss that had already occurred, and of the realization of his own, irreparable, perhaps, guilt. The unveiling was painful. Almost unbearable. But it had come. Too late? That question hung in the air, heavy and silent, like a verdict. The silence that fell in the room was thicker than any scream. Mark stood as if thunderstruck, his gaze wandering from Sarah to Leo and back, as if trying to comprehend the impossible. The unveiling had hit him with the force of a freight train, sweeping away the remnants of his self-assurance and leaving behind only emptiness and the sharp, aching pain of realization. All those years of emotional deafness, neglect, self-absorbed blindness, had materialized in this horrifying scene. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Her voice was even, almost devoid of emotion, as if she were talking about something long decided. "I'm leaving, Mark." 2 words. Simple as an exhale. And final as a verdict. She didn't look at him. She turned and slowly walked towards the stairs leading to the second floor, to their bedroom. Each of her steps echoed in the deathly silence of the living room. Leo lifted his head. His face was pale, an expression of suffering and bewilderment frozen on it. He looked at his father, then at the stairs Sarah was ascending. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? Apologize? Explain? But what was there to explain? Everything was on the surface, laid bare to the bone. Mark remained standing in the middle of the room, like a statue. He heard the closet door open upstairs, something fall to the floor. Sarah was packing. Every sound cut him to the quick. He wanted to run after her, stop her, beg, scream. But his legs felt rooted to the floor. What right did he have? What could he say to her now, after everything? That he had suddenly seen the light? That he understood everything? Would she believe him? Would she want to believe him? After a while, Sarah came downstairs. She held a small suitcase in her hand. She stopped by the door, casting a quick, inscrutable glance at Mark, then at Leo. "Leo, thank you for everything," she said quietly. "You're a good kid. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Then she looked at Mark again. "Goodbye, Mark," and walked out the door. The lock clicked. And that was it. Mark slowly sank into the armchair. The same armchair where he had spent so many evenings, engrossed in his laptop, oblivious to everything around him. Now it felt cold and alien. He looked at Leo. Are you going with her?" His voice was hoarse. Leo shook his head. "No. I don't know where she went. And I can't." He sat down on the sofa, covering his face with his hands. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to turn out like this." "None of us wanted it, son," Mark smiled bitterly. "But it did." They sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, his own pain. Mark thought about Sarah. Where had she gone? What would she do? Could he ever get her back? And did he deserve it? He remembered her words, her look full of despair. And for the first time in many years, he felt scared. Scared of the loneliness that suddenly overwhelmed him with its full weight. Scared of the realization that he himself, with his own hands, had destroyed what was most precious in his life. He stood up, walked to the chest of drawers where Sarah once kept old photo albums. Opened a drawer. The album was there. He took it, sat back in the armchair, and began to flip through the pages. Here they were, young, happy, in love. Their smiles, their gazes. Where had it all gone? When had he stopped seeing this woman, this girl, who had loved him so sincerely? The end of this story remains open. Can Mark change? Will he find the strength to fight for his love, if it's still possible? Can Sarah forgive? And does she need this forgiveness? And Leo? How will this drama affect his life, his relationship with his father? Don't do this. This warning now sounds for Mark like a deafening alarm bell. But will others hear it? Will they be able to recognize in time those same little things, those same insignificant displays of inattention that, accumulating, can destroy the strongest, at first glance, marriage? Mark and Sarah's story is not just a tale of betrayal. It's a story about how important it is to hear and see your significant other, how easy it is to lose what's dearest through your own blindness and selfishness. And about how sometimes, realization comes too late, when the open wound no longer heals, but only continues to bleed, leaving behind pain, loneliness, and countless unanswered questions. What happens next depends no longer on the author, but on them. And, perhaps, a little on you, dear viewers, who now know what not to do. Think about it.